Arancini is the most sophisticated medieval food I've tried to cook yet. But first, a content warning. The following video contains a French-American cook mispronouncing arancini 12 times, mispronouncing agrodolce twice, and serving an absolute disaster to his beautiful girlfriend. If at any time while watching this video you feel uncomfortable, skip to the last chapter to see a successful reproduction of arancini.
Food is arguably the most important resource in Age of Empires 2, but all we see in game is just a single set of numbers. Throughout this series, we will be diving in to see exactly what foods each civilization prepared and ate, and how well I can recreate these recipes. This is Meals of Empires. For those wondering, this is a fennel bulb. It's not your traditional onion bulb that would be underground. This is just all of the stems of the fennel that kind of overlap and create this nice bulbous vegetable that we can use in cuisine, and we will indeed be using it in our salad. But first, a little bit of history on the Sicilians. Sicile was a tribe in prehistory that is given the name to Sicily, the island off the coast of Italy. And many, many different civilizations conquered it. You had the Phoenicians, the Romans, the Byzantines, the Greeks at one point, prior to it being called Byzantium. Then who else did you have? Arabs / North Africans, which in Age of Empires 2 would be represented by the Saracens. You have the Lombard League, which in Age of Empires 2 is represented by the Italians. And then finally, you have the Normans, who in Age of Empires 2 are simply called Sicilians. And so with all those different civilizations, you have a bunch of different ingredients, and therefore you have Sicilian cuisine somewhat closely related to what you'd have in modern times. We have rice and citrus coming from the Muslim influence, and the breading of ingredients coming from the Norman influence, and that's all being combined into the three recipes we have today, which are arancini, those balls that are breaded with rice and a few savory ingredients in the middle of it. We have our salad of the fennel and some oranges, which would have been, as I mentioned, brought over by the Muslims. And then we have asparagus available from the Roman period, since they're from the Eastern Mediterranean, with an agrodolce sauce. That's a sweet and sour sauce. So let's just get started with the cooking. So we can set the fennel aside for now because we're going to start with our arancini. The first step is to making a risotto with our rice and our aromatics. And the first step to the risotto is chopping up our onion and our garlic. The Normans arriving from northern France could be seen as like barbarians from the north, the same depiction that Vikings are often given. Our oil today will, of course, be olive oil. Olives would have been brought over fairly early in Sicily's history, most likely coming from what is modern day Greece by the Greeks. So they're probably, I don't know, like 2,000 years before the Normans landed. There are our onions. We can saute those for about 10 minutes, just lightly sauteing, and then add our garlic shortly after. And then right after that will be our rice. A lot of Sicily at that point in time was also controlled by the Byzantines and to some extent by different emirates, Muslim emirates. So there was some backing by the Pope to help support these, what could be seen as barbarians, but were also Christians, so had some support from the Pope, these invaders. Onions are starting to brown, so I can add the garlic in, and I'll keep it at around the same temperature. So you may recognize this rice. It's the same rice we've used both for the Saracens and I believe for the Spanish. This was likely the first rice to arrive to Sicily along with the Muslims. Egyptian type rice, a medium grain but fairly starchy rice, which is good for our risotto that we're setting up. I'm going to add about a cup, roughly a cup. Since we're not using a strict ratio of rice to water in this recipe, it's not too important that we get the exact amount of rice correct. There's going to be plenty of water that'll be evaporating off the rice. While the onions and garlic are simmering, we can turn on our broth. In this case, I'm just going to be using a bouillon cube, but traditionally I think Sicilians would be using a mix of carrots or celery and maybe even more onions to create some sort of broth, but just for the speed of this demonstration, I'm going to be using a bouillon cube. You could, of course, use water as well. Now is about the right time to add in our cup of rice, but first I'm going to add a little bit more oil because this is a fairly rich dish. A lot of traditional risottos add a lot of butter at this step or even beforehand when we're add the onions. And of course, our vegan alternative to that, to add plenty of rich fat in there, is going to be olive oil. And now we can add our rice right in there. And we want to keep stirring our rice in until most of the grain of rice has turned opaque or transparent. Opaque is probably the better word. It's not going to be completely see-through like a window. But you should at least be able to see into the grain of rice and just see a small white spot in the middle. And that's when you know your rice has soaked up enough oil and is ready to be soaked in water. And our rice may seem paltry in comparison to the onions and garlic. It may seem like we don't actually have that much rice in our dish, but of course the rice will swell up in volume once we add the water and really start getting it to cook. While that is going, we can start on our mushrooms, which will be one of the two ingredients that will go in the middle of our arancini balls. Once the risotto is done and it's been cooled and we're able to put it into little balls, that's what's going to be in here. So to get our mushrooms nice and prepared and flavorful, we are going to brown them in the pan once the rice is done. So let me prepare the mushrooms. We're going to add just enough broth to cover the rice at first. And then we can add more broth as needed as it evaporates away. But you can see the temperature of the pan has stayed nice and warm. Pan continues to bubble, which is exactly what we want. So we may need a little bit more broth on this risotto, but it's already feeling more supple. It's not bouncing as quickly off of the spoon. Overall, this process can take like 20, 25 minutes, I'd say, roughly, in previous experience. So the risotto is about 80% done. I've turned it off. And I'm going to let it cool a little bit, but we're going to cool it further in the fridge, but it's not quite. It's still a bit too hot to put in the fridge. So while we set that aside, we can do the first trivia question. What invertebrate plagued Robert Guiscard, which was Robert Guiscard, the leader of one of the Norman invasions? What invertebrate plagued his military camp as he tried to siege the Muslim-controlled city of Palermo, now the capital of Sicily? The invertebrate that plagued Robert's camp was tarantulas. Now, probably the only time we come across tarantulas in a modern sense, unless you're like a field biologist, is maybe in like some horror movie from the 80s or 70s. But tarantulas, for those who don't know, are ground spiders. And in a modern sense, like there's a very clear definition of what a tarantula is. There's one species found in Central Europe. The difference is the term tarantula wasn't well known back then, or like well defined. So it could have just been a wolf spider, some other ground living spider. Tarantulas spend most of their time underground, but during certain seasons, especially fall is when I've encountered them the most, they'll just come out and they'll be crawling around trying to find their way, trying to find insects to feed on. And they're not like the smartest creatures, so they might just, crawl up your boot. And I can imagine if you had a military camp ready to siege a city, the last thing you're going to assume is that you're going to be plagued by tarantulas. The only place that I've been able to find more information about this is in the book, The Oxford Encyclopedia of Medieval Warfare and Military Technology, Volume 1. Unfortunately, it retails for $350, which is slightly outside of my cooking budget of 20 euros. All right, so I have this dish of just a glass dish that I often use in the oven, lined with baking paper, and I'm gonna put the risotto right on it, spread it around to increase the surface area, put it right back in the fridge and allow it to cool. And the reason we're doing this is because we want the starch to solidify back again and just get it really sticky before we try to roll our arancini balls. I think just 1 hour should do the trick for us if we can spread it out as much as possible. I might have preferably used a larger dish, but I only have so much space in my little fridges here. So the next step is going to be browning our mushrooms. I'm just going to reuse the same pan and let it heat up now and get some of this water off. The main part of browning the mushrooms is going to be using olive oil to saute the mushrooms slowly and allow all that wonderful browning action to take place. Asparagus is a very interesting plant because it just grows right out of the soil like that. Imagine a cutting board's our soil, and then we just cut it there, and that's our vegetable. Most of the asparagus plant doesn't really have like traditional leaves. It's a lot of just stringy stuff like this that has chlorophyll directly in it. That's what the green part is. If you ever see white asparagus, you're going to be looking at asparagus that's been sheltered from the sun. It's very common in Germany. They'll build earth berms like on either side of the asparagus as it's growing, and then that prevents light from hitting the asparagus tissue, prevents the chlorophyll from being produced in the asparagus. It's said to make the asparagus more tender. And then, of course, before the growing season ends, you need to make sure that the asparagus plant does have like a full grow, and it'll grow up into like a stringy looking bush that's not very appetizing looking at all. Then it dies back down during the winter, and it goes through the process all over again. To prepare asparagus, you generally just want to like break it in half like I did accidentally, but a little like break it in half motion will take off the more tough end at the bottom, and will just leave you behind with the supple top end of the asparagus, which is what we'll be roasting. Like I can hold it all the way up top and it'll still mostly snap in the same spot, though it's a little bit harder to snap. And my father actually grew some asparagus in the backyard. He was willing to wait those 2 to 3 years. It's not like it takes that much room to grow asparagus. It even can tolerate some slightly saltier soil conditions, whereas a lot of plants, can't tolerate salt whatsoever. So along those maritime bluffs of Sicily, you could have asparagus growing, since it's a native to the Eastern Mediterranean. While we wait for the mushrooms to cook down, our second trivia question is, Italian shaved ice is a concept that began to develop as the Muslims brought a variety of fruit and fruit syrups to Sicily and southern Italy that, of course, are the basis for the shaved ice. You have your ice that's all chopped up into different textures depending on what part of Italy or Sicily you're in, and then you add some sort of syrup or juice onto the ice. But the question is, where would medieval Sicilians have gotten ice to make what is now known as Italian shaved ice? Where could you find ice in Sicily? So Janissary pointed out that likely it could have come from the Alps, wrapped in straw, handled on a donkey. That would make sense for northern Italy, but if you're coming to Sicily, the only place that I know it would reliably snow is on Mount Etna, or just referred to as Etna, which is a volcanic mountain that's about 3,500 meters, but as a volcano, that elevation changes as it erupts, and it's still actively erupting today. It gets about 5 inches or 11 centimeters of snow. But the question remains, would you be willing to risk a volcanic eruption for some Italian shaved ice? All right, mushrooms are starting to stick and brown, so this is where I need to pay attention. They smell so good. I hope the flavor comes through in the arancini, but we're only going to be putting such a small little portion in each of the rice balls that I don't know if the flavor is going to come through all the way. So our asparagus is going to be coated in olive oil before it goes in the oven to roast. For my oven, I don't salt until it's come out of the oven, just to allow it to cook well. If I salt it first, it will get some of the water to come out prematurely, and that water is somewhat what's being relied on to superheat and start cooking the flesh from the inside. So I don't want it to dry out too much before it's well cooked, which is a risk. Our other filling along with the mushrooms is going to be our pistachios. Pistachios were available to the Isle of Sicily ever since the Roman period. I believe Romans were planting pistachio trees throughout Italy, though I believe they originated in the Middle East around the Caucasus Mountains. A common way of preparing pistachios into the arancini is to make a bechamel sauce and blend the pistachios into the bechamel sauce. But of course, in the medieval period, we had no blenders. I'm wondering which of the arancini I'm going to prefer. I mean, the smell of the mushrooms right now is so intoxicating. I think while the rice is still firming up in the fridge, we can start on the salad. So we're getting our fennel and 2 oranges. Let's start with the oranges. So the first oranges that arrived to Sicily would have been brought by the Muslims, and they would have been bitter oranges. That's what was originally used just as an ornamental tree, because orange blossoms, regardless of the variety of orange, all smell just as sweet. The only real application for bitter orange, as far as I can tell, is to be used as marmalade, which is popular mainly in England and maybe a little bit in Portugal. Janissary can tell me if that's true, if he's ever encountered that. And yeah, because I don't have the chance to try bitter orange right now, I'm just going to go with the traditional sweet orange. One orange is going to be used as juice, and one orange is going to be inserted directly into the salad. I'm going to start slicing the orange. Whichever one I do a worse job of slicing is going to turn into our orange to juice. I don't have a juicer. I'm simply going to do as the Sicilians would have done and just smash it in between my fingers. This is generally easier when you leave the skin on, so there's fewer avenues for the juice to squeeze out. We're just going to have like a rough handful of raisins, and they're going to be rehydrated in our orange water juice. So here's our fennel. We're going to be starting from the root bit first. We're going to take just a little bit off to get us started, get some of the harder portions off. And I'm going to use the mandolin to try to get as small and as clean of slices as possible. Oh, that's not cutting as well as I was hoping. That just took it apart. Okay, we got one little slice out of it. But yeah, it just started disintegrating. So we're just going to do fine little slivers, half moons if they happen. The fennel is great because it has a little bit of a crunch that it provides. And we're just going to go till we get to the green, and then the rest isn't as aesthetically pleasing, I find. Fennel is a native to Sicily and the Mediterranean, but it has spread all over the world and is considered a weed in a lot of places. Sometimes it's confused with anise, which is very similar, a cousin of fennel. The seeds are very similar, but anise does not have this bulbous form at the base of it. Other than the raisins, we're just doing the fennel and the oranges, and so the fennel are going to have some of that sweetness, some crunch to them, and the licorice flavor I mentioned are oranges. I mean, most people are fairly familiar with oranges. You get a bit of sweetness, you get a bit of citrus, some lightness. The sauce that our asparagus is getting is very simple. It's called Agrodolce. So we have our sour component, which is our red wine vinegar, and our sweet component, which is our sugar. Red wine would have been already existing in Sicily. Sugar would have been arriving with the Muslims. And I guess you could have the sauce prior to the Muslims' arrival in the 800s, and it would have used honey as the sweetener instead. Our pan is warm enough. We're using a 2-to-1 ratio, in volume of vinegar to sugar. All right, now the pan is ready to take the vinegar, and we can sprinkle on the sugar and try to help it dissolve with a little bit of stirring. There are many different varieties of agrodolce sauce out on the internet. You'll see a lot of them just being prepared with the food while the food's being cooked. But in this case, because we're roasting the asparagus separately, the sauce we're also going to make separately. And you do have to watch out what type of cookware you're using. Some cookware does far worse with acidity than stainless steel. The only issue with our sauce is it's not very thick, and there's no components in here to really thicken it. So here is our risotto. It's definitely cooled to the touch now, and I can feel that the grains of rice are sticking to each other. Not maybe as much as risotto, so we'll give this a try and see how well it all sticks together. We do have large pieces of onions in there too. That might be breaking up the rice grains from sticking to each other. You have to imagine flour would have been the original method for breading, though I guess breadcrumbs would have been available as well. But they'll also use like panko, which are, specifically used just for breading ingredients. And I can start heating up our oil, and we're going to need a decent amount. Yeah, this rice definitely has a lot less starch. This first rice might be quite difficult, and it's not going to give us that perfect round ball that we're looking for. So if you want better balls, go for arborio. Flour will still stick onto the surface. The size of the ball is going to be drastically reduced just to what I can make stick together. It's held together so far. All we can do is just hope and move on to the next one. Okay, those are just the plain ones. I didn't make a mistake. I didn't forget to put the filling in. Those are just the plain ones. That's fine. All right, so we have our first plain one all done. I'm not sure which god to pray to, given the number of different religions that held control of Sicily. but I do feel like I need some sort of divine intervention to make sure these come out okay. So to add our filling, we want to create somewhat of a little patty, and ideally this would be sticking all together and not to my hand, but of course it's just sticking to my hand and not together. We're going to add a little bit of our mushroom, just put it right in the middle, almost like a coin-sized amount, and then we're just trying to wrap it around, though of course it's not really anything that can be wrapped, it's all individual pieces. So we're just going to try to be as dexterous as possible. Yeah, that's mostly stayed together. We don't really see much mushroom, so it's promising. Once it goes in the oil, it seems to stick together fairly well. I have it right on its edge, which isn't ideal. I think it's going to fall over. And it seems to be separating already. Oh no! Let's help it. Let's help it. Oh, okay, first disaster. I think the other recipes that we're trying out today are going to work out. Yeah, they've completely fallen apart. We might just be eating little bits of the resulting food. We can move this to the side, and I'll use the space right here for the last little bit. So we're just going to take our soaked raisins and place them right on our salad as our third ingredient. So a little bit of red wine vinegar, just a dash, just to add a little bit of acidity into our mix. The third trivia question is, what fruit does arancini get its name from? You could kind of guess what fruit might it look like. The fruit that arancini gets its name from is the orange. The etymology of the word arancini is from arancia, which is Italian for orange, similar to the Spanish naranja. It has that ARA segment to it. And it's similar to the Persian and Sanskrit names for oranges. So you can kind of follow the path as we have done so many times in this series. And the last trivia question, which is a bit of a joke, what landmark and trees is Sicily known for? Of course, it's its beaches. Sicily is surrounded by many beautiful beaches and covered by many beautiful beach trees. Sicily, prior to the arrival of agriculture, was probably completely covered by forests of beech and cypress and pine trees. But in Roman times, Sicily was known as a breadbasket for the ever-growing Roman Empire. And my personal opinion, as someone who's had the privilege of growing up in a post-empire society, is that we should try to preserve as much of the natural environment as possible. You know, there is a trade-off to growing as much food as possible, is that you have less natural environment for all the different species and for people to enjoy. And I think deforestation and the extinction events that happen in every single Age of Empires 2 game are something that could be explored more deeply in the future. So I'm just going to plate the asparagus over here. First, we have the arancini.
It's supposed to be arancini.
Probably. I've probably been saying it wrong the entire episode.
I think you have, because the C is a ch sound.
Thank you. The arancini is supposed to have pistachio and mushroom in it.
Okay.
These were our test batches. These are the only ones that survived the frying process.
Okay.
The future ones were just falling apart. I blame our rice. We have Egyptian-style rice, which isn't as starchy as the traditional arborio that you would find in a risotto that's very starchy.
They have that here.
I know they have that here. I was assuming the Egyptian-style rice was sticky enough, and I thought wrong. I was thinking, all right, rice originated from, or was brought from Egypt into Sicily by the Muslims, and I was hoping that would be enough. Moving on, we have the asparagus with an agrodolce sauce, a sauce that has both sour and sweet components. So we have the vinegar along with some sweet sugar. And then we have our salad. The principal component is the fennel, which are the white strips that you see there, the orange, and then the raisins have been soaked in orange juice. And we have noted for the record that you're very unwilling to try the salad, but hopefully all the mix of flavors will be interesting enough. There'll be enough sweetness in there to carry it through.
The texture is not pleasurable.
Really?
Yeah.
I like the crunch.
The crunch is fine, but it's like
the orange isn't as tender as you would want it to be. Do you like the raisins?
Maybe. It's not as bad as I thought.
Okay. Asparagus?
There's no salt.
Correct. Forgot to add salt.
Were you supposed to add salt?
Yes. The pairing of the sour vinegar and the sweet sugar is decent proportion.
Think it's fine.
Okay.
Okay.
And your last component is the arancini arancini, sorry. It's almost like a risotto that has been breaded or floured and then fried in olive oil. So it's a pocket risotto. A risotto to go.
Fried stuff.
Just to translate, Abby said, I like risotto, I like fried stuff.
Okay,
But,
I'm ready.
Execution score.
I don't know what this is. What's it called? What's it supposed to look like?
Insalata, finocchi, arance.
Like, all the pieces are kind of cut up differently. Like, you have some really small bits and then some really big bits, and those factors did not make it my favorite.
Mm-hmm.
These obviously weren't what they were supposed to be,
Mm-hmm.
but I feel like you did a good job with the sauce.
Mm-hmm.
Take a point off for each thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, do I take an extra point off because
it was such a big disaster?
Because the kitchen's a mess now?
Yeah, I think.
Do you want me to take an extra point off?
I think that would be fair.
Okay, then we'll make it a 6.
Okay, I think that's very fair. And should you serve this to your girlfriend?
Like a whole ass meal.
Yeah, if this was your whole ass dinner, what would you rate this out of 10 times?
Eat that.
You would not eat the salad.
Mm-mm. I'd have this. I'd have both. These are both sides.
You can. Okay, yeah.
I mean, first of all, these are cold, so.
It's also like risotto to go, so it's not always going to be burning hot.
Risotto to go?
Yes. That was the advantage of breading the food, is that it would keep longer.
Okay. Also a 6.
6 for should you serve this to your girlfriend. Okay. There's components you enjoy, but overall the meal is pretty much average. There's some good crunch in there, though. Bye. Thank you, Abby.
You're welcome.
I didn't actually try the asparagus. I don't think asparagus was the right vegetable to demonstrate the sauce, but because I try to keep the ingredients varied, asparagus was the one I chose. Another ingredient that the Muslims brought into Sicily would have been eggplant, but again, because we have so many different recipes that are already using eggplant as one of their ingredients, I wanted to change things up. The salad, I think, would be better without the raisins. Pine nuts, as Abby mentioned, instead, because that gives it like a different crunch. Also adds some protein, because there's almost no protein in any of these ingredients, unless because I failed to get the pistachio into the arancini. But the raisins don't really add anything. The orange is nice, but a higher quality orange would be better. That was less pithy. This is very much a juicing orange, which is a lower quality, I would say. And the fennel is nice, but I understand what Abby's saying. If all the pieces were a little bit more even in their size, it would be nicer. I even think this fennel is actually a little weak in flavor. And if I soak the fennel in orange juice instead of the raisins, would be in a better state for the salad.
I went ahead and remade the arancini the next day with the arborio rice. They came out so much better. I made both the mushroom and pistachio versions, though the dominant flavor is still that of the rice. I only used about half an onion this time, so there would be a greater proportion of the sticky rice to make sure everything stuck together. The arborio rice does take about 20% more time to cook than the Egyptian-style rice, but it also has about 100% more starch. I fried 2 balls at a time to ensure the oil stayed hot enough, and another change I made was to wet my hands when handling the balls to prevent the ingredients from sticking to my hands too much. I have to say they came out beautifully. Next week we'll feature the Burgundians, so subscribe if you want to be notified when that video is live. Until then, I'll see you in the comments.